You will hear a number of different recordings, and you will have to answer questions on what you hear. There will be time for you to read the instructions and questions, and you will have a chance to check your work. All the recordings will be played once only. Now turn to Section 1. Section 1. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 4. Now we shall begin. You should answer the questions as you listen, because you will not hear the recording a second time. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 4.
Most of us are familiar with a local park. We spend time there, play there, and have some of our best memories in these places. But what is a park? Basically, it can be defined as a natural, or at least semi-natural, piece of land, planted with a variety of trees, bushes and flowers, protected and reserved for the enjoyment of all citizens. There are usually regulations about the sorts of behaviour that can take place within, and sometimes there are facilities such as children's playgrounds or fields for ball games and other sorts of activities. For this reason, if there is grass, it is kept short, and this also discourages the breeding of insect pests. A well-maintained park actually needs a lot of people to look after it, and more so if the park showcases special plants, flowers or trees, in which case it is called a botanic garden. In complete contrast, if the park is big and remote enough, it is sometimes designated as a wilderness park, to be left completely alone and untouched, protected from all development in order to allow wild species, both plant and animal, to live undisturbed. But it is the urban park, the sort of park that most people are familiar with, that I want to talk about now. These preserve natural landscapes for the pleasure of the urban population, most commonly just for passive recreation. In other words, allowing people just to observe the trees and lie in the grass, and such passive recreation is certainly needed.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 5 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 5 to 10.
Continuing on the subject of parks, it might surprise you to know that once there were none. 1,000 years ago, there was no need, since there were already extensive open spaces, forests and wilderness surrounding most cities and towns, for example in Europe. These dark, dank forests were large and even dangerous, full of wild animals and with the potentially fatal result of getting lost. Hence, fairy tales evolved about witches living in these areas and the wolves and bears which could threaten young children. However, with the rapidly increasing human population, the original wilderness and natural open spaces were intruded upon. Forests were cut down as population spread, and with them, urban pollution and further deforestation. But it was only with the advent of the Industrial Revolution that people realized natural areas needed to be preserved to give the populace access to the sort of nature that was fast disappearing due to the uncontrolled development and demand for resources. The first park expressly designed for that purpose is usually considered to be Prince's Park in Liverpool. This was in 1841, on land donated to the public by a rich iron merchant. With such a generous donation, worth about £50,000, the council decided to invest £5,000 of its own money in making it look good. Consequently, they hired a landscape designer, Joseph Paxton, who designed twisting turning pathways among shade-giving trees, all based around a central lake. In many ways, it became the prototype for all later large parks, including the famous Central Park in New York. But if we were to pick the park that most people are familiar with, it would be the much smaller neighborhood park. These can be tiny, but by being in the midst of extensive development and dense populations, they are increasingly seen as a refuge where one can get a glimpse of true nature. Many psychologists now maintain that this glimpse is necessary, for ultimately, as a species, we have an innate affinity for nature, and the concrete urban zoo clashes with our inner being. This has seen the rejuvenation of many urban parks that were once left to decay, for example in New York or London, and indeed some cities such as Melbourne are known all over the world for their abundance of carefully maintained parks, including a world-famous botanic garden.
That is the end of section 1. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 2. Section 2. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 15.
Hi, Miss Harris. Here we are talking once again.
Well, I'm always willing to help out wherever possible. Is anything troubling you?
Well, your advice last week about writing summaries was very useful, and I'm using these summaries a lot in order to prepare my final master's thesis.
But you're having problems, right?
Yes, I have a few issues to discuss. Obviously, I want a good essay, and I want to achieve high marks, but I'm not sure on the best way to start.
That's an easy question. Start with a topic, but not one that I necessarily suggest, but one that you want to explore. You will always write better when doing so on a topic you are interested in, not one imposed upon you by others.
Well, I'm interested in management theory.
Then pursue that. However, that alone is far too broad. Break it into various current areas of discussion and relevance. Then look more carefully at one of them. Say, management and cultural differences, or management and motivation, or other aspects, such as the role of salary, group cohesion, or leadership.
I would say I'm interested in group cohesion, that is, how people interact in the workplace.
Well, that's a start, but you can't then just write planlessly without defining exactly what you intend to do within the area you've chosen. You'll have to think of a thesis, and this statement could be of several types.
Such as what?
Oh, you could argue a point, something that you believe in, or discuss an issue, looking at its various perspectives, or critique the opinions of others, pointing out the pitfalls and flaws. The thesis statement will make that very clear because it will say, in simple terms, what you intend to achieve in your essay.
I see. And then I can just begin writing, right?
Wrong.
Huh?
If your essay is going to be clear, it needs to be logical and organised, and this means you'll need an outline. This could be written as a flowchart or spider graph, that is, a series of connected lines. But whatever shape the outline takes, there must be a sense of progress in, more or less, a straight line towards a goal.
And then my essay will be good?
With such progression, definitely, as long as you do achieve everything that you set out to do, as specified in the beginning, okay?
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 16 to 20.
Well, Ms. Harris, your advice about essay writing all sounds very useful, solid and step-by-step, so I'll certainly follow that. But can you tell me in more general terms, what constitutes the best essay?
Oh, there are many aspects to consider, but one of the most important is certainly original thinking. The best essays are written by people who think for themselves, and not just copy or imitate established views.
I think I can do that.
But remember, you can't just give a list of unsupported assertions. There needs to be support as well. A chain of logic linking each step in your argument.
Right.
Yet that alone is not enough. Your argument may be logically sound, but is it practically so? For that, you need examples from real life to illustrate your points or subpoints.
I've got lots of examples from my course readings. I suppose I could use them.
But remember, whenever you use an example or facts or figures that are not commonly known, you must give a reference. That's an academic necessity, without which your writing will automatically fail.
So it's necessary to give these, right?
Absolutely. And with that, your essay will be fine. But always ensure that you format it clearly.
What do you mean?
I mean the practical considerations, as written in the University Style Guide, such as leaving appropriate margins, using double spacing, Arial font, and so on. You see, your writing must look good as well as be good.
I can certainly do that.
And finally, related to the previous point, you need to respect the number of words required. Your individual lecturers will give you a word count figure, so follow what they say, making your essay neither too long nor too short. Perhaps 10% either way should be acceptable. 15% was common when I was younger, but it's a lot stricter now, and 20% would be pushing the boundaries just a little too far.
I guess I can do all that. Thanks for your advice.
That is the end of section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 3. Section 3. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
Hi, Emily. What did you think of that lecture?
A bit hard to follow, but I have some good lecture listening note-taking strategies which really help. so I can review the lecturer's message later.
Lecture listening note-taking strategies? Review it later? That sounds interesting. I must admit, I struggle a bit to take down the gist of what I hear. Look at my notes.
Well, I can see a basic problem immediately. You're writing full words, such as century, when all you need is a C. And don't write increase, just draw an up arrow. And why write thousand when a TH will do?
I see. Just use symbols. That's not a bad idea at all.
It's the most basic strategy, allowing you to record information at a faster pace. These lecturers can talk faster than others too, so you don't want to waste any time. But you need to be very familiar with your set of symbols.
Why?
Because you'll have to look at these notes days, weeks, or even months afterwards when you begin writing your essay. So you'll need to be able to interpret them at a later stage.
I think I can do this, even by looking at your notes. Imed must mean immediately.
But regarding the lecture as a whole, I knew the professor would be giving a set of specific recommendations and comparing two alternative approaches, so I formatted my page in advance, adding the features consistent with the nature of what I was going to hear.
I think I need an example of what you mean.
Well, look at my page. Before the lecture, I drew large headings saying recommendations. You should always draw these, and I draw a table saying approach 1 and approach 2. At the end, I drew a flowchart, as obviously the final recommendation would be a step-by-step approach. Then I was prepared in advance to simply fill in the spaces.
Wow! Now that's clever.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
Your advice about note-taking sounds great, but I still have one question, Emily. How are you able to design your page in advance? I mean, how can you predict the nature of the talk and know which design is likely to work best?
It's rather obvious when you think about it. What's your next lecture about?
Legal studies.
Well, that suggests to me that you'll need a flowchart, since the judicial system has a very logical, do this first, do that second approach, which must be followed in that order. You know, all the processes that happen in the courtroom and the procedures that must take place to ensure complete legality.
Sure, that's the way law is, very linear and orderly. But what about culture studies? That's just a mass of comparisons of different cultures.
Which tells you that you'll need a table where, in tabular form, you can efficiently write down information.
But often the lecture's not that simple. The professor throws in a really complex mix of ideas.
Then use a spider graph, like the web a spider makes, where there's a central idea around which you attach all the associated thoughts and ideas and impressions.
I see. I think I understand. And that would be very quick too, very efficient. I like that. But what about management theory? How would you approach that?
The same as with culture studies. I'd use a network, which is basically the same as a spider graph, linking thoughts, although this time there are directions involved. It is this element that makes it different, the fact that the thoughts go one way and not the other.
Okay, has directions. It sounds logical. And what about the other subjects, such as political science? There's no predictable order to that.
Well, for that I'd just put my notes in a line, that is, in linear or straight line fashion, and these notes would use symbols, of course, to save time.
Okay, that just leaves mass media.
For that, I wouldn't have any special design at all. As you say, sometimes it's impossible to predict in what way lecturers will present their information. in which case the best you can do is pre-write headings, but not specific, just general, as in Main 1, Main 2, Sub 1, 2 and 3, and so on.
OK.
But always be prepared to adapt to the nature of the talk, using any one of the other methods if it becomes appropriate at the time.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 4. Section 4. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Travel and tourism is the largest industry in the world, but calculating its economic impact is quite difficult. The one thing everybody can agree on, though, is that it's huge. There are two things which have influenced the growth of tourism. There are firstly, social factors, and secondly, technology and the way it's developed. Let's consider the social factors first of all. Demand for tourism is determined mainly by the amount of wealth a country has, which is why countries such as Japan, Australia, the USA, and Western European countries have contributed most in terms of tourist numbers in the past. However, growing wealth in developing countries will mean that demand for holidays abroad will take off there in the near future, boosting tourism enormously. That said, the majority of tourists are still from what are called the developed nations. However, studies show that their number will not rise much further in the next few decades because their populations are fairly stable. As a result, there'll be a growth in the number of retired people who will have more time on their hands. This will influence the kind of tourism wanted. Fewer skiing holidays will be required, but there'll be an increase in the number of people wanting to visit art galleries. Let's turn now to the second factor in the growth of tourism. The technology that sustains mass tourism today is the jet plane. Air travel has opened up the world. In 1970, scheduled planes carried 307 million passengers. Today, there are 4 times as many. In fact, cheaper and more efficient transport have been behind the development of mass tourism from its beginnings in Britain in the 19th century. The first package tours were arranged in 1841 by Thomas Cook, an entrepreneur whose company subsequently became one of the world's largest tour operators. In his day, it was the railway that allowed his business to flourish. Today, technology is proving important in other ways as well as in transportation. In the past, people went to a travel agent to find and book their holiday. Now many of these people are bypassing the high street travel agents and booking their holidays themselves on the internet. Airlines have been keen to encourage this direct approach as it keeps down their costs. And increasingly, high street travel agents are finding their businesses disappearing. These days, there may be more tourists to go around, but there is also more competition among destinations, as cities, countries, and continents all compete for tourist revenue. But becoming a tourist destination is not quite as straightforward as it may seem. For example, Ireland used to sell itself as a place to enjoy the beautiful countryside. However, it soon discovered that it was attracting young student backpackers without any money. So how did Ireland set about increasing revenue from tourism? Well, the Irish Tourist Board came up with the idea of promoting the country's literature, using the names of writers such as Oscar Wilde and James Joyce to appeal to older, richer tourists who would spend their money in the hotels and restaurants of the country. However, there are other ways of appealing to tourists. The U.S. is dotted with places that claim to be the capital of something or other, sometimes things which may seem rather strange. Crystal City, for example, is the world capital of the vegetable broccoli. And then there's Gilroy, famous for its garlic. These towns are trading on a single gimmick to attract the tourists. Festivals are another way to bring them in. Literary, food, art. They're all staged for one reason only, to attract tourist revenue. Many a town has sought to copy the success of Stratford, Ontario, which was transformed from a small, run-down, blue-collar town to a bustling cultural center by the efforts of Tom Patterson, who managed to persuade a British director to stage their first drama festival in 1953. But then, boosting a city through tourism is nothing new. In 18th century England, bath spa became fashionable after the owners of the hot baths employed Beau Nash, the trendsetter of his day, to promote the city. I want to end the lecture there for today. Thank you.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.